this on? Yeah, we're good. Cool. No, I'll be loud. Yeah. All right. So yeah, as you said, this is Fast Adversaries, Fast Countermeasures. We've both given versions of bits and pieces of this talk before, but hopefully this collaboration should be pretty new and eye-opening. So let's just get right into it.
My name is Robert Hansen. I'm the Vice President of Labs at Whitehat Security. I've also written some books and stuff. Used to run hackers.org, Black Hat Advisory Review Board. I'm on a .trust advisory board as well, which if you've never heard of, you should probably talk to me about. And I like breaking the web. I do that pretty regularly, actually.
And I'm Matt Johansson, and James Wiggett's walking around here, and I left him up to my bio slide last year, and he called me the Beard of Destiny, so I've just kind of adopted it and left it on here. Sorry, Jack. I know. Listen, I didn't pick it, right? And I like to call myself a Gauntlet cheerleader. You'll hear about Gauntlet later in this presentation. I want to be a developer. I just started as director of security a few months ago for a startup in downtown Austin here, so I'm newly local. And we're called Honest Dollar, and yeah, we do 401k alternative type stuff. We're a financial tech firm, so handle people's money. So it's cool that they hired a security person, and I've done this talk thing once or twice. So.
All right, so I spent a lot of my time talking with bad guys, actually as much as I possibly can, given I'm a pretty busy guy. And I've started noticing that they're doing a very interesting shift. And I talked to them about it, and this is kind of the stuff that interests them. The faster that they can get, the better. So once upon a time, if you wanted to scan the entire internet, let's say, using let's say Nmap, it might take you months or many months even to scan the entire thing. Because frankly, we just didn't know what we were doing back then. The internet was a very big place, bandwidth was low. Processor speed was low, and et cetera, et cetera. Nowadays, because of a change in the Linux kernel that happened a couple years ago, it actually can happen if you're just doing a single port, let's say, you can do it in minutes, maybe half an hour max, if you know what you're doing. And that change to Linux kernel is effectively you can open more than 65,000 ports at once. That used to be the bottleneck, and now that's no longer a bottleneck. Now it's just bandwidth is the bottleneck. So effectively, any sort of TCP or UDP scans are something you can do in real time if you feel like it. You can say, I found a vulnerability, I can go scan the entire internet, find every single vulnerable machine in that half hour. So the old school way, if you wanted to hack a company or something, is you'd use some tool I wrote called Fierce to do a DNS enumeration, figure out all the different non-contiguous IP spaces out there. Then you use Nmap once you figured out what those IP addresses were and scan inside that IP ranges of wherever the targets are. And then you find all the vulnerable machines inside that IP space. And that worked pretty well. It was slow, but it worked pretty well. Nowadays, you use stuff like ZMap and MassScan, and you just scan the whole internet. You don't really need to be super targeted anymore. You can just extract the data of the target you're interested in from the results of that scan. So this photo here is a photo from the Internet Census Project, where they were basically scanning so fast they could see outages happening during Hurricane Sandy. So as machines were getting turned on and off due to the hurricane kind of going through the area, they could see machines turning on and off because of that, local power outages and so on. I've heard similar techniques used in bomb assessments in wartime. To make sure that the bomb actually hit the target, you can just sort of ping the address. Once the address goes away, you know the target is dead. So that sounds bad, but it's much worse than I just made it sound. Because it is fast to scan the entire internet, yes. Scanning the entire internet, I could, if I'm looking for a single port, let's say there's a specific type of version of Apache or PHP or something that I think is vulnerable. I can scan the entire internet, find every single vulnerable machine in, let's say, half hour or whatever. But there's much faster ways to do it. I can pre-compute that. The internet doesn't change that fast. I mean, it changes pretty fast. Let's be honest. I mean, things are changing and evolving all the time. But as a whole, the internet doesn't change that much on a day-to-day basis. So if I were to scan the entire internet, let's say once a week or whatever, I would get 99.99% the same value as I would if I scanned it in real time. But the advantage is, instead of me spending half an hour after a vulnerability has been launched, now I spend only milliseconds to go look it up in my database, and then seconds from that point to go attack the targets that I know are actually vulnerable instead of just guessing and finding something out there. So there's a number of different projects that are working on this. One is the University of Michigan in conjunction with Rapid7. Is anyone here from Rapid7? Yay. We love this project. The HTTPS ecosystem scan is one example of it. The DNS reverse and forward DNS service fingerprints, that kind of stuff. They have a bunch of different versions of this. Very, very cool project. Mubix had a offline project for a while. I don't know if he brought it back online or not, where he was doing reverse DNS scans of the entire internet. I think he stopped doing that project for a while because he truly just ran out of disk space, which is a pretty terrible reason to stop a project. So as soon as he gets another disk drive, we're all screwed. Unicorn was actually a very cool thing, and most people think Heartbleed is dead and gone and over and not worth talking about. That is not at all true. It is probably one of the most interesting projects out there. So what this guy did, no one knows who he is, he's anonymous. He scanned the entire internet looking for Heartbleed, and then you pay him like one fraction of a Bitcoin or whatever, I forget what the actual dollar amount works out to be, but you give him a little bit of money and he'll tell you whatever he found on Unicorn at whatever time he found that thing, which might not sound that bad. I mean, you could just scan the entire internet looking for Heartbleed yourself if you really felt like it. But he has historical information as well, which means let's say you patched Heartbleed today, you found it on some server, you're like, oh, whoops, it's sitting out there, you patch it, you think you're good, like no one can attack us anymore. Well, he can say, I still have the data though, I mean, it's still sitting on my hard drive. If you want to pay me some amount of money, I can show you what I saw at the time. And what he saw was what was ever in memory, and what was ever in memory could be things like source code, could be passwords, could be cookies, could be API keys, or whatever. So from a forensics perspective, that is a total nightmare because they compromise you on the first request. Like they know exactly what username and password to try. So if I'm looking at the logs, which are normally terrible anyway, but I'm looking at the logs and I see the very first request is the one that compromised you, I'm going to assume it had to have been an insider or you leaked something out in some weird way or whatever, when in reality it's Heartbleed and it's something that you've already patched. So that just makes Heartbleed that much worse. The other one is the Anonymous Internet Census Project or whatever. This was actually a really cool project that was, again, done by Anonymous. No one knows who it was. Somebody compromised 1.2 million routers, and they used those routers to scan the entire internet. And they were doing it really, really, really rapidly. They were able to scan effectively the entire internet multiple times per second if they felt like it. They weren't doing it that fast, but they could have. And basically, how this bot actually worked is they tried usernames admin password, admin12345 or 1234556 or something, like 4 or 5 different combinations, and that's how they hacked into 1.2 million routers, right? That's how stupid our security is really. So this photo is, oh good, you can actually see it. Sometimes it's too dark. This photo is what it looks like when the Karna botnet was scanning the entire internet. So this guy was nice enough to put up graphs, like pretty graphs. Some of them are actually like moving. You can actually see like the internet like turning on and turning off as the day cycles go through. It's really cool actually. So that's where we're at. That's where our adversaries are capable of doing, which is pretty nasty. So I'm sure most of you have heard of Shodan. Yeah, probably, cool. Basically, Shodan just gives you HTTP headers and the IP address associated with it. So if I knew that let's say I think I did a search for some version of PHP. If I knew PHP 5.3.3 was vulnerable to something, I could go and attack those basically just by paying a little bit of money and get 1.5 million machines that would be compromised, effectively immediately as soon as I sent that packet, the magic packet that would compromise them or whatever. So the reason why I think that's important and an interesting distinction from typical security is a lot of people say obfuscation doesn't work. It does work in some cases. For instance, if I don't know to look for your HTTP header or whatever because it's magical or something or unique to you, okay, fine. If I know that I only want to attack people with this particular thing and you're not omitting it, you save yourself a little bit of time. Same thing with putting yourself on a high port or whatever. So that time-based obfuscation, giving myself like a few seconds, sort of works, but it's getting worse and worse. It's not something that you should depend on. If that's like the thing that's securing you, and like your passwords are still crappy, but you have SSH running on a high port or something, you're dead. You're going to get compromised. You might save a little bit of time. You might save yourself a day or something, but you're still going to get popped if somebody really wants to get you. So this is a case study that White Hat did. I don't know how long ago. 3 years ago. 3 years ago, something like that. Well, there you go, 2013. Okay. So basically, this is a vulnerability that came out Ruby on Rails. I'm sure you guys remember. It was a big deal back then. And so you you're sort of seeing the time frame as things go on. It's been noticed by the adversary. It's been published or whatever. But the important part is that little box there. That is the time at which it took them to patch and the time it took before they started seeing the attacks come in, which was really what we're talking about is hours of difference, which is terrible. I mean, that's sort of our security comes down to hours. But the most important thing is the one right before it, right before it. The Metasploit releases a command injection. So this is the HD Moore's law or whatever. As soon as it gets released on Metasploit, that's the counter. That's when it starts going. The nice part about this, I know it doesn't sound that nice, is that it took 2 days before that was actually starting to really get attacked. 2 days. And this company managed to not get hacked because they were able to roll something out in a day and a half. That sounds like really fast. Like most people are like, I can't patch in a day and a half. But in reality, you have truly minutes. Truly minutes. You don't actually have a day and a half. They lucked out, basically, is what happened.
So for those of you who've seen either of our presentations before, usually that's kind of where we are like, yeah, you're all screwed. See ya, right? That was really fun, and this was really scary and dangerous, and I'm going to continue to scare you a bit and tell you why everything that Robert just said matters. But what? Microphone? I'm not loud enough, guys. Sorry. So yeah, I'm going to continue to kind of scare you a bit and tell you why what Robert said matters. But the last half of this presentation, we're hopefully going to tell you some techniques that you can speed up your countermeasures here. So as our title suggests, that that you can actually do something about this, right? So why is the speed at what all this is being found matters, right? We saw the Ruby on Rails example, right? But that's just one. Okay, yeah, Ruby on Rails had a terrible O-Day that came out, and within a few days we were seeing the whole internet get scanned for it. But that's just one vulnerability, right? We see vulnerable code absolutely everywhere. We've known about cross-site scripting. When?
2001.
2001, we knew about cross-site scripting and immediately knew how to fix it, and it's not very hard to fix either. Like, it's not a really complex problem to understand. You know what it is, you know how to fix it, and roughly half, no matter what language it is, roughly half of the sites that this is based on a stats report that White Hat put out a few years ago. Half the sites that were tested, of 35,000 sites, had at least one cross-site scripting vulnerability on it. I mean, we still see this absolutely everywhere, right? And go down the line, and you're just seeing this is percent. The way to read this graph is this is the percentage of sites running that language with at least one of that type of vulnerability, right? So you're still talking thousands of sites that still have this vulnerable code everywhere.
And
right?
cross-site scripting is still very useful to adversaries, by the way. A lot of people kind of like poo-poo it, like it's not that interesting of a vuln. Bad guys love it. Open redirects, putting malware on other people's sites, turns out really, really useful.
Right, and then so every time I put this slide up, I purposely leave out what scale it is, because I think one of the first times that I put this slide up, someone from Etsy was sitting in the room. Is anyone from Etsy here? I know there's a few people floating around the conference. So Etsy's pretty famous for their DevOps capabilities and rolling out security fixes quickly. One of the famous stories from them is they spotted someone doing a bug bounty test, find a cross-site scripting vulnerability on their site, and they rolled the patch out before they got notified by that guy so that they could pay him out. Like, they're incredibly fast. They push code, dozens of times per day on average or something like that. It's crazy, right? And so I put this slide up, and someone from Etsy was in the crowd, and I started talking about it, and they're kind of nodding along. They're like, all right, yeah, average time to fix. Okay, and they thought that this was in hours, and this is in days, right? So this is the average time to fix per vulnerability per language type in days, right? So you're talking, on average, by the time we notified someone, I say we, I don't work for White Hat anymore, but by the time White Hat notified a customer of a cross-site scripting vulnerability, they knew about it 254 days on average before that vulnerability was fixed, right? That vulnerability could have been open long before, it was notified about, and you can kind of see this gets worse as, for different vulnerability types and so on and so forth, right? So I think on average, what was it, a serious vulnerability? I think around 190 days of any vulnerability type that is serious that could cause data loss to your company, about 190 days, right? And we're seeing, that the bad guys are getting way too fast. 190 days that's unacceptable, right? It cannot happen.
It's 190 days too long. Seriously.
Yeah, it's just crazy. That's the vulnerabilities. That last slide is the vulnerabilities that ever got closed. We measured the time between notification and the time between fix. There are tons of vulnerabilities that we notify and never get fixed, right? So this is percentage. The way to read this is the percentage of vulnerabilities that got closed even once notified, right? So it's kind of a reverse heat map here. Orange is bad, blue is good, right? The percentage of that type of vulnerability that got closed. Even like blue is by scale good here, but you're reading this as, okay, about 80% of them are closed. I'm reading that as 20% of them are just open forever, right? and that's okay, yeah, that's kind of blue on this graph, but that's awful, right? It's still way too much, right? And then I like to throw this in just because we use some pretty granular terminology here that not everybody might be familiar with, but I assume that everyone here is familiar with the OWASP Top 10, and this is the average number of vulnerabilities per website of the Top 10, the OWASP Top 10 classification, right? So per one website that we test, it has around 15 different injection vulnerabilities in it, right? So vulnerable code is absolutely everywhere, and it's everywhere for a very long time. And as Robert said, we need to fix it in minutes. So what's going on, right? How are we gonna fix this gap here, right? And really what it comes down to is the companies that we see that are actually doing this well have a very mature build pipeline, right? And they're really automating their development life cycle, and they're using tools like Travis and Jenkins to be able to be pushing code multiple times per day, right? Not a very big and clunky traditional change management, let's release every month type thing. Whereas a month, as we just said, is a month too long, right? If you have to wait a month to get a security fix out, you can get hacked, thousands of times in between the time someone knows about that vulnerability and the time that you can get that fix out.
So one semi-nice thing is the adversaries haven't adopted this completely yet, because it does take a little bit of infrastructure and a little bit of knowledge. But what I am seeing is they're very rapidly moving in that direction, so you still have a little time left. It also doesn't count if the vulnerability is internal or whatever. They're not going to be able to attack that nearly as easily as something external. So you kind of have to take it with a little bit of grain of salt. Those numbers do matter, but they are possibly representative of things behind login pages or whatever that may be harder for somebody to find programmatically. So take all that with a bit of grain of salt. But everything I said is still true. It's just, a little bit of lead time here. That's probably the nicest thing I'm going to say all this entire presentation.
Just happened? Who are you? So I say a lot of these nice things like build pipeline and automation and yada yada. We hear this day in and day out, right? But like I had in my bio slide, I like to be a Gauntlet cheerleader, and I really believe that the idea behind Gauntlet and the actual application of something like Gauntlet is very important if you are going to be adopting this rapid, continuous integration, continuous deployment code model where you're going to be not only just getting security fixes out, right? And this is the part that, how many people are developers in the room? Work for, oh, awesome. Wow. Okay, that's a way bigger percentage than usually at a security conference. That's great, right? So normally the security people have to try to figure out how to speak to developers about security issues, but you all are in the 1% now that you're here, developers. Congrats, right? And so to be able to not only speak about a security issue, explain why it's important, what's bad about it, and then how to fix it, and then how to fix that every time it comes up again in the future is a really hard conversation to have, right? So in order to kind of assist in that and try to bridge the gap of this conversation, I think a tool like Gauntlet is very important. How many people are familiar with Gauntlet, or maybe have heard me talk about it in the past? A few of you. Okay, cool. So what Gauntlet is a tool that's a security framework that's built on top of Cucumber. So a lot of you developers might be familiar with Cucumber. If you're not, what Cucumber is just a unit testing framework, a behavior-driven development type framework of building unit tests into your build pipelines. So you say, okay, when I click this button, it's supposed to turn blue. It does turn blue. Cool. The light stays green, and then the code goes out the door type thing, right? And then ever more advanced than the blue button, right? So what this really comes down to is building security automation tools and tooling into your build pipeline without overwhelming anybody and slamming anybody or any developer or any security person with false positives, or being the security person that has to come in and say, hey, this code can't go out the door because I think that there might be a cross-site request forgery possibility here. You don't want to be that person, because that's how you either get fired or get ignored from then on, right? You don't want to slow down product getting out the door, because that means you're slowing down money coming in the door, right? Which keeps the lights on, and everyone. This is not a battle that should be new to anybody, right? So the Gauntlet philosophy is, how can we automate that and pre-build these tools into this build pipeline? Be a good citizen in the Jenkins and Travis ecosystem, where you're plugging into the stuff that already exists, and you're kind of speaking developer, right? Developers know how to write tests for their code, hopefully, right? And some sort of tests for their code. And so now you're saying, okay, that test that you wrote, well, we're going to write this thing that looks exactly like that test, but it's going to be a little bit more security focused. And if it fails, that's really bad, right? And let's write the test in the right way that it'll only fail when it's really bad, right? Type thing. And it's all open source, which is really nice. So this is what a Gauntlet test looks like. This is also what a Cucumber test looks like. If any of you are familiar with Cucumber, this will look familiar. But this is kind of what it's going to look like in Gauntlet, right? So it's pretty natural language, which is also really nice, right? It's like, given some situation, when some other situation, then expect this. And if you don't get this, then fail this test type of thing, right? So in this example, given Nmap is installed, right? Because we're going to have that as part of this Gauntlet package, and run Nmap. Like when I run some Nmap scan on my host name, the output should contain port 80 and port 443. I should have included in here, but and should not include other ports, right? Should not include anything else. How easy is this to just throw into your unit tests? It runs every time code gets pushed into production, and you just make sure that no one opened some port that they used in development and it just stayed open. It's really easy to do. We see it all the time when people are coding on development branches on GitHub and then just merge to master without turning off some things that they did to make their lives easier while they were writing code. Things like AWS API keys winding up on GitHub because I didn't feel like typing that in as an environmental variable every time I was testing my code. I just hard coded it in. Oh, but it's just a development branch, it's okay. And then it gets merged into your production code, and all of a sudden your AWS key is on GitHub, or just too public for comfort type thing. This is just a way, hey, let's just run a scan, make sure you didn't expose anything you didn't want to leave exposed in production. And if it is, then fail the unit test, just like any other unit test. And then the build does not go out the door at that point, right? And any of you are familiar with Jenkins and Travis, you get a big red light, right? And managers love green or red lights, right? it's good or bad. It's really easy, right? So for any of you who are interested in Google, these are some links. I'll send these slides out so you can click on these. This is the way to kind of keep up with it. It's on GitHub. It's easy to play along with, right? Again, I'm just going to go into some more practical. If you guys are really interested, this is exactly what it looks like, right? So how many people use Travis like as a build pipeline type thing? No one. Oh, wow. Okay, so Jenkins, you're familiar with Jenkins? Okay, so Travis is just like Jenkins, but it plays really nice with open source type tools. The way I describe Jenkins is a tire fire that you should keep separate on your network near nothing else, right? But nothing meets it in functionality, so I get it. It's like a necessary tire fire that you have over here and keeps you warm. But that's pretty much it, right? So what Travis is, it's just like Jenkins, plays nice with open source. And here's what you're going to just throw into your Travis file when you're doing Gauntlet type stuff is you're going to go and just install the type of security automation tools that you want to install to run some type of scans, right? And here's what it looks like. Just okay, hey, go run, go install SQL map and point to it. Go install SSLIs, make sure that our certificate is always up to what we think it should be, and go install Derby and things like that, right? Then you just bundle it all together. This should look familiar for anyone who's done Cucumber type stuff or build pipeline type stuff before. And then just as part of your build, you say Gauntlet, run this type of tests, and we're gonna have these .attack files. I have a whole 2.5-hour presentation about this, so that's why I'm just running through it right now. It's way too detailed. I just wanted to give you guys a feel for what it's like, it should be familiar for developers, right? But we're gonna have these .attack files that we're gonna run, and that's how we're gonna classify what we're testing as part of the build, so that when it fails, we could say, hey, my email leakage attack is what caused the build to fail. So you're not just like, hey, build failed, security guy, what'd you do? You say, okay, no, that's exactly what failed. You know the line of code, who wrote the line of code, you know exactly where to fix it, and so on and so forth.
You can also use wildcards here too. So
Sure.
if you had like thousands of attack files, rather than having to remember to add them or accidentally missing one, you can just do a wildcard and it'll just add all of them, which is kind of cool.
Sure. So this is what one of those attack files look like. It looks, just like the Nmap test before. This is, what an email leakage one might look like. There's a tool called Arachne out there that does pretty good, quick command line type security automation testing. And if you really rain it down and run very specific tests at a time, you're not going to get overwhelmed with all sorts of weird warnings and false positives and stuff like that, right? So for this, it'd say, hey, run the Arachne module that says, check for emails, right? And basically it's just going to fail if you leaked an email that you didn't expect to leak, right? Some internal email that wound up in a comment somewhere that said, hey, email Jim at whatever if this code doesn't work, right? Like, hey, we don't want that to end up on our production website. And the output should not contain, and it's just some regex, right? Okay, cool. And then that would fail. And this is exactly what would show up in the build when it failed, is this sentence, right? With whatever the regex matched on. So you know exactly what failed, where it is, all that kind of stuff that I already said. Backdoors, same thing. This is, this is the SQL one. I thought I switched this. Okay, so sorry, these titles are switched. So this is actually a SQL map one. So this is, hey, given SQL maps installed, you guys are probably familiar with SQL map, run some, limited SQL map scan on this form that I just created, right? That is going to talk to the database and make sure that it can't do some basic injection, really kind of minimum bar, make sure this code doesn't go out the door with really obvious SQL injection that something like SQL map can test, because that's what the fast adversaries are using. They're using security automation also, right? This isn't like, hey, the foolproof, we're going to stop ourselves from any sort of targeted attack. This is, don't let something go out the door that's really obvious that someone scanning the internet is going to say, hey, look, SQL injection, right? Which is how most SQL injection gets found and exploited, because it's a really annoying bug to look for. Sorry, again, titles switched. So this is the backdoor one. So Arachne has a backdoor module. Hey, just make sure we don't have any sort of ports open or anything like that, right? Really just simple stuff, and keep it as bite-sized as possible, and kind of just make it as part of your development lifecycle, saying, hey, are you coding a form that's going to insert something in the database? Okay, you have to include this, this, and this attack file, and don't worry about the rest of it. Hey, are you coding, are you working on our authentication system? We'll run this attack file that's going to check and make sure that our cookies are valid and so on and so forth, right? And you can kind of tailor it that way. You can write CSRF attack files. You can check for basically all of the OS top 10. Most of it is really automatable and able to kind of tweak in a way that you can write a unit test to check for it, right? So now Robert, in non-Robert fashion, is going to tell you about, okay, what are you going to do with this data in a good way and not try to scare you, hopefully.
I suddenly feel like an optimist, which is really weird.
You have your own way.
So when you're talking about risks, there's all kinds of different risks that we all face on a day-to-day basis. When we talk to our exec teams and say, hey, we have some SQL injection on some form on some website, their eyes start glazing over immediately the very first second. Like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what these words are. I don't care. Is this bad, and how bad? And it's really hard to quantify that. And I find myself, unfortunately, in that conversation a lot, trying to explain what the damage potential of things are, rather than talking in business terms. Because your management doesn't give a crap what SQL injection is, what command injection is, what LDAP is. They don't know, they don't care, they don't want to know. They're resistant to any knowledge. But what they will hear is, what is the actual business impact? Is it bad, is it not bad? I personally think that whole red, green, blue, or whatever, what the different like stoplight thing that we all have, probably not blue, that it just is a terrible design. I think it's terrible. If I have one website sitting on the internet and another website sitting on the intranet with the exact same vuln, if I look at a vuln scanner, they'll say they're identical. They'll say that they're both red and you should fix them both immediately. But intuitively, we all know that that is not true. One of those things is going to get compromised much more likely than the other thing. I'm not saying that you shouldn't necessarily fix the one behind, but I'm saying practically that is definitely not the very first thing you're going to attack. Now, a medium severity vuln in production compared to a high severity vuln on the back end, which one wins? I don't know. It kind of depends on what the risk is, right? So thinking about risk more holistically is a very important thing to do. So, so if this, let's say, is a graph of all the known vulnerabilities you currently have in your application. On the vertical axis, you have the expected value of loss post-compromise. So whatever the cost to the company is, if that vulnerability gets compromised, that's what the cost would be. On the horizontal axis, it's the investment pre-compromise. So it's however much it would cost to fix the vulnerability now before the bad guy actually goes and breaks it. So that's the time trade-off thing. And we intuitively all know that this is true, right? I mean, theoretically, anything could happen to me right now. Someone could lob a grenade at me right now and I would die. Now, I have done an internal risk rating and I've said, I'm probably not going to die by grenade today. You know what I mean? Like, we all do this all day long. It's sort of an intuitive thing. But we don't apply this to computer security for some reason, or not very programmatically, and this is might be one way to do it. You apply a risk curve. Now, this curve is completely dependent on your company. Some companies will have a very risk-tolerant curve, others will have a very risk-adverse curve. It just depends. I'm not being programmatic here and saying you should use either of these. I'm just saying this is an example. Yours might be an exact line going from 0 up to infinity exactly at a right angle, or a 45-degree angle. But theoretically, if you say that, if I go and talk to the oil and gas industry and I say, if you give me $100, I can reduce $1,000 out of your risk profile, what do you think they would say? Hello? Anybody? Take a guess? Yes, no? Fix it? Don't fix it? You say yes? You say yes? Anybody else? Unfortunately, you're all wrong. They would say no. And the reason they'd say no is because they don't care about $1,000 worth of risk. It doesn't matter. If they spend even 1 minute with you on the phone, they've already lost more than they would gain if they were drilling just a little bit more. In fact, they could have an entire oil well blow up and they still don't lose any significant, it's like not even a rounding error. It's literally not worth talking about. An entire oil derrick can blow up and they still don't care. The only reason they might care is because it would change laws that would affect them. So they don't care. They're very risk tolerant, very risk tolerant. Now, if you talk about some particular assets that they have, for instance, the oil mining undersea like exploratory maps or something, that right there, that one file might be worth $1 billion to them. So that, on the other hand, they care a lot about. So you have to talk in terms that they actually care about. So their curve would look completely different than, let's say, a mom and pop shop where you may be selling candy or something where $1,000 of risk might put them out of business. So you have to, your risk tolerance looks completely different from another company. So this is not meant to be prescriptive, just you know. And the simplest way to do it is say, if I had $100, would I fix $1,000? Yes, no. If I had $10,000, would I fix $100,000? Yes, no. And you just answer the question for yourself and you can sort of plot where your graph would go. But anyway, anything above the graph, page down me here, anything above the graph is something that you've just said you were willing to fix. Anything below the graph, you said, for whatever reason, your company is willing to accept that risk. I'm not going to tell you why that's a good idea or bad. It's just that's what you've decided as a company. And you fix from the upper left-hand corner down to the efficient frontier of the curve, whatever where that curve is. So that works pretty good until you talk about vulnerabilities you don't know about. So for that, they have what's called insurance. Insurance is actually good at solving that one problem. If you don't know about the vulnerability, you can insure against it. You have to do a lot of work to get to the point where insurance makes sense, but if you do, go ahead, press it, Matt. Jeez.
Your animation.
I know, I got my animation. It actually worked this time. Switching from Keynote to, or whatever. Anyway, it actually brings it down to a point where it's no longer worth worrying about and trying to find and fix, because you can actually pre-calculate what the total expected value of loss would be for all of those potentials. Now, how do you know it's worthwhile? You sort of have to guess. Like, we would assume that based on our current knowledge and how often vulnerabilities are found, we may have 10% liability hanging out there that we just don't know about. So is that 10% worth fixing by virtue of insurance? Maybe. Maybe it's not too. It totally depends on your company. So in this next graph, let's say we have an average vulnerability, whatever that vulnerability is, that we call bad. So hit me, Matt. So let's say it's above the curve, and let's say it's something we've all decided we definitely want to fix for whatever reason. It's bad, the company is going to go under, or whatever, if this thing happens. It would be really nasty. Well, let's say over time we have some agreement where we decide to outsource it to some company out of India or something, where they have very different SLAs around whether they're going to fix vulnerabilities or not. It might drive up the cost significantly to fix that vulnerability. It hasn't changed the threat of the vulnerability. The threat is identical, but the cost of remediation has gone up significantly. So maybe it's no longer worthwhile, right? You kind of have to calculate it again. So then let's say you stop clearing credit cards on that website because that's the thing the adversaries are going to go after. Now, the vulnerability is still there. You haven't changed the vulnerability. But the risk of that vulnerability getting compromised is actually pretty low now because you're not clearing credit cards. Now, maybe they can put malware there or phish people or something. So there's still some risk, but not the same risk as if you had all the credit cards with all the PIN numbers and CVV2 numbers and whatever on there. So no longer worth fixing. Then let's say you install a web application firewall in front of it. You're like, well, we're not willing to fix the vulnerability, or the vendor won't fix it or whatever, but what we can do is put it behind Cloudflare and Capsula or DOS Arrest or whatever, or put an actual web application firewall physically in man in the middle or whatever. Now, we haven't fixed the vulnerability. The vulnerability is still there. If it were exploited, it would still be just as bad, but we have mitigated it to the point where all we have to do is turn on one rule. So the cost of remediation, not fixing, remediation has gone down significantly. So now it's maybe not really worth thinking about compared to where it was before. And then Anonymous knows about you and wants to kill you, right? And then suddenly you're back on the radar again, right? So this is why it's really nice to have ongoing metrics as opposed to sort of a single snapshot in time. This is not something you do once and then call it a day and say, oh, okay, we did our risk analysis, we're never going to touch that again. This is something you do all the time. And as you get more intel, so that's where threat intel comes in very handy, you can start doing much more interesting stuff with this graph. So we are here today to talk about something that Matt and I have been working on for, I don't know, whatever, something like that. It's called, for some amount of time. And it's called SAGA. SAGA stands for Security Architecture for GRC Automation. And the idea behind it is taking all of that stuff that we know to be true, whatever that stuff is, that kind of collective knowledge of our intelligence around what you should do with security, and sort of combining it into one set of tools that are all sort of combined. So the idea is, although this is not actually going to happen as fast as I described it, the idea is you could do all this stuff with a single person or a very small team and get all the same benefits or even better benefits than a very large company with a bunch of resources. So very first thing, day one. I would show you pictures of this, but we just decided to talk about it this morning. So you'll have to just imagine it's amazing. It's really, really shitty, actually, but my UI skills are lacking.
Wrote it in Perl.
So day one, it's not Perl, it's my CSS that's the problem. CSS, Perl's amazing. So day one, you have to do something like figure out what you're compliant towards. You have to be PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant or SOX compliant or whatever, right? You have some compliance standards you need to meet. And those have technical controls around whatever those things are, right? So if it's PCI compliant, you have to have OS Top 10 or whatever, right? Whatever those things are. And that dictates a set of rules. So instead of making you go and do all that work, what we're doing is putting it on a framework. So you say, I have to be these 3 things compliant. And it just outputs the things you probably need to go do. And you basically say, yep, 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 and you click and say, those are all things I agree to, and it just outputs this massive, extremely, if you were trying to do this yourself, it'd probably cost you a ton of money. Fortunately, I've done a lot of this work before, so I can sort of just give it away for free. And I would say if you went to Deloitte & Touche, KPMG or something, it cost you $250,000. You get it for free, so there you go. So you press the buttons, it outputs these crazy reports, like FINRA for the financial guys or whatever, and then you have this massive set of documents just ready to go. Those have technical controls, though. You need to actually do stuff. Just because you've got policies and procedures doesn't make you secure at all. Promise. I know it sounds crazy, but you don't get anything out of having that. And so the next part is day 2. I need to know what you own before I can help you get protected. If I don't know what you have, I can't do anything for you. Basically using a bunch of different open source stuff and scanning and whatever, you can sort of collect all that stuff and get it into one big pile. So I'm doing this crazy side project that does stock prediction, long story, don't worry about it. But anyway, I can aggregate a lot of information about what your posture looks like on the internet. From there, I can say, this is what you probably have. And you say, yep, 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 I own all that stuff, or no, technically we own it, but it's a third party or whatever, it's out of scope. Or it's in production or not in production or whatever, and sort of assign different attributes to it. Now that all feeds into your build pipelines, which is day 3.
Oh, I'll talk about that?
Sure,
okay.
Why not?
So a part of this whole piece that kind of fits with this whole build pipeline thing is also doing asset management type stuff. Sorry, I put the mic down. So we're gonna going back to that risk graph, right? How you actually implement something like that without just saying it nice and having really, really cool animations on slides, by the way.
Thank you.
Right?
All right.
Besides just doing that and kind of waving your hand around and saying that, if you're tying these vulnerabilities to an asset, right? An asset being your website or a server or something like that, whatever you want to call an asset. Okay, we have a SQL injection vulnerability on our, whatever.com homepage, right? And I know that it takes, X amount of person hours to work on that thing because we have to take them off of this, whatever that whole thing is calculated, we're going to know the exact cost in order to put that dot somewhere on that graph, right, of what this cost to fix actually is in real dollars and cents terms, which people really like talking about, right? So if you're going to do that into your build pipe, like if you're going to be doing this security automation into this build pipeline with things like Gauntlet or something like it or nothing like it or some sort of commercial tool or whatever it is, when something gets flagged as, hey, this is a vulnerability, while the code is in this whole build pipeline situation, all of the numbers associated with it in cost to fix, time to fix, and all that kind of stuff right away in an automated fashion and tied to Jenkins. So we've
right now it's working for Jenkins.
Yeah, worked on a Jenkins plugin that will plug into this system that we're talking about.
And Jira.
And we'll create a Jira ticket if it finds something, and with all of the dollars and cents associated with it, and we'll put it on a graph that looks just like that, where you can worry about, hey, if this is compromised, it will cost my company $10,000, and to fix it, it will cost us around $50,000 because we have to re-architect this whole thing. It's going to take us 6 months. Oh, well, screw it. Like we're not gonna do that because the money doesn't work out. But if it's your $100, $1,000 example, maybe we'll fix it because it's really quick. And this is all kind of cool and automated, like we said.
So I've actually put a CPA on retainer who does like financials for multi-billion-dollar companies and stuff. And he had some changes he wanted to make to it. But basically, as you have a certain amount of change in the company, your asset changes value too. So he said, as a CPA working for these publicly traded companies, I would say before an M&A, before any public event or whatever, I know it sounds weird, but I would actually fix every single one of these vulnerabilities. I've never heard anyone say that before. And I'm like, but knowing full well that it's not worth it, and you're a mathematician, right? You actually know how this stuff works. He's like, yeah, but it actually makes the company worth more. Get this off the books. It's a liability. So it improves the valuation of the entire company to get rid of every single vulnerability. So by putting it in a context that he can agree the math makes sense, he was willing to go to bat to fix every single security vulnerability. That is incredible. I've never heard anyone say that before in my life. All right, so that's day 3. We're on day 3, right?
Yeah, we're gonna do Q&A in the hall. I know we're over time, but yeah, just ask us questions in the hall. So we have a few more minutes.
Oh, well, we'll just do it. And so day 4 is I need to put all that stuff on that risk graph. So that's the thing you already saw. So that's already built. That's actually fairly easy. Right now, we're not plotting a risk curve beyond just does it cost more to fix than to get compromised? If so, don't do it. But that can always be changed, right? If you want to make a sine wave or whatever you wanted to do, that's all possible. And so the last day, and something we haven't talked about, is the knowledge of what the attackers are doing. So you guys remember in 2012 when Facebook did that mood manipulation study?
No, Robert, what's that?
Oh my God, I can't believe you don't know about this. We definitely should all know about this for insecurity. So they basically they took a sample size, I think it was like 400,000 people or something, and they gave them only positive or only negative things to look at to see if that could shape their mood. And of course it did, very much so, as a matter of fact. And so I have that code. Anyway, so you can apply that semantic knowledge on top of anything. You can apply it on social media, you can apply it anything you want, right? And that gives you sort of semantic overlay, which is the sentiment of whatever they're saying, good or bad, right? Is it generally net positive, generally net negative? So if you have, let's say, 10 people on the internet talking about your company, probably, or a brand or a particular asset, whatever we're talking about, it's probably not worth talking about. It's probably not that big a deal. If you have 100,000 people talking about it negatively, it might be something you should beef up your security on that particular asset. If the entire internet is exploding talking about your stuff and it's primarily negative, you're going to get hacked. It's just going to happen. Look at Sony. And so you need to apply that knowledge to the vulnerability, down to the vulnerability. So by virtue of knowing what the asset name is, by knowing what the brand name is, and correlating that together and applying the semantic overlay, call it threat intel. If you have actual threat intel feeds, that's great, because that helps too. But you apply all that stuff to that vulnerability, and it helps you fix in the correct order. You know which vulnerability to fix, in which order, so you reduce the spend. Because right now I think we're spending on the wrong vulnerabilities. We're actually, I know it sounds really weird as a security guy, but we are spending too much money in the wrong places. We're fixing the wrong vulnerabilities. We're going on our gut, and our gut is totally wrong. We have tons of proof to prove that people are not focused on the correct vulnerabilities. Otherwise, they wouldn't be getting hacked all of the time. They're spending in the wrong areas, or not spending at all because they don't understand the risk. So that's Saga. 2BD, we're still very much in the weeds.
We're using all open source stuff, and this is all going to be things that we can kind of actually show you. It's a whole talk into itself that we squeezed into the Q&A section of this, so sorry about that. But yeah, the one other thing I forgot that's also really important, that's actually helped me in my job, is to be able to tie these vulnerabilities, just to put a bow on this, to tie these vulnerabilities to the policies that you spit out on day one. Right? Saying, okay, this vulnerability makes us breach this policy that we have put in place that says that we are PCI, HIPAA, FINRA, whatever, compliant. That all of a sudden opens some budget to fix that, and will also change where that is on that graph, right? This has actually already helped me, right? I've actually, magically, some money appeared when I said, hey, this thing, the SEC would not be happy about that. Oh, okay, well, here's an extra couple K to make that go away. All right, cool, great. And this is all, again, automated into your build pipeline saying, hey, I found this on this line of code. This person checked it in on this date. It's this problem. It's on this asset. It will cost this much to fix, this much if it was exploited, and it makes us yes or no compliant on HIPAA. All in your build pipeline every time you push code.
And
right?
and to put a bow on it in a different context, just to bring it back to that. No, just a different bow. So that's the business reason to do it. The other reason to do it is if we don't do it, the adversaries are speeding up, and we aren't speeding up at the same rate that they're speeding up. So we need to come up with better strategies, because what we're doing right now totally is not working, and it will stop working or work even less good down the road. We need to figure out better ways to do that, and this might be one way to do that. But even if you don't go our route, you should be doing something very similar to this, or figure out some other strategy that gets you the same net effect. So that is it.
Quality assurance in the hall, Q&A, because we went exactly over our Q&A time. And yeah, if you don't track us down, we'll be here for, oh, he's going to Formula One, but I'll be around. But we are both very accessible on Twitter. So yeah, thanks for coming, guys.